Welcome, folks. You are listening to Race Matters here at WJOP Chopper Radio, Newburyport, Massachusetts. I am Eddie Carson, the host of this show, and I'm glad you've come in for us to delve into the funk again for another week. One of the things that I wanted to share with you a little bit is this idea as it relates to de facto and de jure segregation. And if you don't know what those two words mean, I want to take just a second to define them because I think it's really important, particularly as we talk about the topic of the color of law. De facto segregation, folks, is this idea that people elect to segregate themselves when they don't want to live around folks who don't look like them. They buy into particular neighborhoods. They send their kids to certain schools. They congregate at certain churches just to make sure that they're able to keep the spaces around them looking like them. And you know what? Let's just be honest. We're talking about really the ways in which white folks historically have engaged in de facto segregation. De jure segregation is segregation that's legal, that's forced. We think about apartheid in South Africa. We think about apartheid here in the United States, known as Jim Crow. As we launch into this a little bit, I want to share and talk about this work with you for a second. And if you have not leaned into this book, I think you need to take a second to do it. I mean, it is simply outstanding, right? The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America by Richard Rothstein is a wonderful read. What makes it a wonderful read is that it is scholarly, it is statistical, it is approachable, albeit it's a lot of information that can overwhelm folks. What I appreciate most about the work, though, is the fact that it tells the truth about a history here in the United States that people oftentimes don't get in our high school history classes or our college classes unless they're are really interested in understanding the processes of segregation. They are completely oblivious to the ways in which segregation has really shaped the dynamics of the United States. Most people don't understand, right? That as folks migrated out of the urban areas, we call it white flight, to the suburbs, highways allowed that to happen, right? Systems in place allowed that to happen. But you know, the great thing about this book, The Color of Law, is the fact that oftentimes, and I do believe people bear a great deal of responsibility here, is the fact that our very own government, this country, is built on an infrastructure of structural racism where that system was designed in many ways to make sure we existed in a setting of de jure segregation. Yeah, the book sheds light on the topic that has really come to shape not only the political structures and the way segregation works, particularly when we think about single member districting when it comes to voting, but also the economic landscape of the United States too. I mean, again, systemic racial segregation, intentional, the kind of history that you don't learn about. When I was in school, I learned the fact that soldiers went overseas to fight in World War II, and when they came back, they had a whole system with the whole VA setting, FHA setting taking place, the GI Bill, all of these things designed to welcome returning soldiers back home after World War II, in order for the economy to be able to absorb that workforce, particularly since the dynamics and structures had changed, many women really leaving their homes during World War II and going to work. But yet, what my textbook didn't say And I spent some time kind of going through some textbooks, what was often left out by my teachers. And again, textbooks can only cover so much. I'm a history instructor. There's only so much information that we can talk about. Although I think this information is important, is the fact that Black people were left out of all those benefits in that entire system that constitutionally they should have been rightfully granted. In the color of law, Rothstein's work. The reality, folks, is that it's a sobering reminder. For me, it was a sobering reminder of how deeply institutionalized racism is embedded here in the United States, particularly within the history of the United States. And I think the key thing here, and a wonderful thing about the color of law that I think is just really impactful, is the fact that you start to see those ripples, right? Those waves, the effects throughout society. I mean, it is ubiquitous. It is formulated. It is one of those things that is now deeply ingrained that we don't really want to talk about. Right? People say, oh, this is DEI. No, this is fact. This is history. This is critical race theory. No, this is a reality in terms of what happened and what transpired. Right? I mean, I think the lesson that we can delve into by looking at the color of law is the fact that if we really look at this book and then do our own independent work, right? I mean, I don't think we should always resort nor depend on one single source, but I do think it allows us to understand the roots of racial inequity and work toward creating, a more equitable society. But that's challenging. And one of the things that I'll talk about in terms of it being challenging is this notion of de facto segregation. Remember what I said, de facto segregation is this idea where people create structures around embedments of segregating from other people. And while that's true, it doesn't wholly tell the entire story that's there. I mean, at its core, the great thing about this book is that it tackles, it dismantles the myth of de facto segregation. It does. It blows it up. This idea that racial segregation here in the United States happened naturally or as a result of individual choices. People deciding, oh, I want to go live in that house in this neighborhood and I'm going to spend all this money. Oh, and this neighborhood just happens to be all white, and the church and the school and everything centered around it just happens to be all white. The author, Rothstein, instead provides what I believe is an overwhelming amount of evidence to demonstrate that segregation was de jure. And remember that word de jure, it centers around the idea that it's systemic, it's legal, it is like apartheid, it is like Jim Crow, it is, or I would say it was enforced, but I mean, we can even kind of talk about in present tense, is enforced and perpetrated by governmental policies at all levels. And I'm not just talking about at the federal level, but we're also talking about at the state and local level. Because see, if you remember your US history, one of the things that was quite ingrained, and one of the things I believe for a long time too, folks, I'll be honest, is that Jim Crow took place primarily at the state level. And it took the federal government to kind of come into the rescue of Black folks, people who look like me, to free us from the injustices that existed under the Jim Crow South, de jure segregation. These policies were not subtle or incidental. They were deliberate, they were actionable, and they lasted for decades in a way that excluded Black folks from opportunities to build wealth and to live in safe and prosperous and expansive communities. These are things, when we talk about the percentage of African Americans, Black folks here in the 21st century, there is no sense of inherited wealth. It just does not exist whatsoever. One of the most striking things that the work talked about is the fact that it delved into the what we would call the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration. And the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration role was really designed to enforce segregation, right? A lot of us learned that the FHA was really designed to create opportunities for all Americans, particularly those who are returning from overseas. But that's just not the reality that existed there. And Rothstein in his work just does a great job really pinpointing and giving a number of wonderful examples. From the 1930s onward, the FHA refused to insure mortgages for homes purchased by Black families, or even for homes in neighborhoods where Black families lived. I thought it was interesting because, see, if you were a progressive white person and you elected to sell your home to a Black family, you got put on a list that made it difficult, if not impossible, for you to borrow money to get a mortgage for another home because no one would insure you. And this practice really illustrated a relationship between the federal government and banks and how they co-opted this system and really generating this system of de jure segregation that was problematic. You know, Many of you probably know this practice known as redlining, and that may be a word you're familiar with, that essentially denied Black Americans access to home ownerships, which has long been the primary means of wealth accumulated in the United States. There are a number of Black folks who've never owned a home, who never will own a home. And the reality of that, of course, is that the system was stacked against them long before many of them were born, even as they were navigating their way up through their communities. When I was in high school, when I was in college, I will confess, I'm a truth teller and I have to do that. That even for a small period of time in my US history class, I really talked about the great example of the expansive suburbs called Levitt towns. And we're talking about Levitt towns in New York, for example. And we talked about the growth in the industry and the emerging wealth booming in the United States and the fact that people were making their way into these communities. And yet, they explicitly barred families, Black families, make sure I get that correct, from purchasing the home in that community, in that neighborhood. We talk about the ripples and all of these things in the way these systems were set up, right? The effect of these policies, and I won't even say were, I think they have been devastating and far reaching. I've mentioned on this show before, and I've used this example in my classes and other public talks and lectures that I've given to people, that the Boston Spotlight series in 2016, they did an investigative study. And in Boston, in the greater Boston area, they discovered that the average wealth for a white family was roughly $255,000. In their research, again, this is the Spotlight series that's connected to the Boston Globe, they discovered that the average amount of wealth for Black families in the greater Boston area, $8. $8. And a lot of that is really linked not only to some of the current predicaments as it relates to structural racism, but also past predicaments that have been problematic for a long period of time. By being excluded from home ownership, Black families were denied the opportunities to really to build generational wealth, invest in their communities, and have access to better schools, good public service. I mean, let's talk about here in the 21st century today, right? The racial wealth gap, as I just mentioned, in America is a direct consequence of those policies. I mean, people think, well, that's the past. That's critical race theory. We shouldn't talk about that stuff. Let's move forward. How do we move forward when people are not delving in nor reading the kind of things they should read and to really expand their sense of the systemic realities that exist in a de jure segregated world. Recent studies, when they think about the median wealth of white families, it's nearly 10 times that of wealth of Black families, 10 times that of Black families. This disparity, it didn't emerge out of anywhere, folks. I mean, I think that's the thing that we need to talk about. It just didn't kind of grow like a plant, whatever. It was engineered, it was created. You know, I'm not an optimistic person. And for those of you who've listened to this show before, you know that about me. But I am hopeful. I mean, I do the things that I do. I have this show. I teach my courses. I engage in activism and community things. I'm an author. I'm a lecturer. I'm a nice human being. And I do this stuff because I think it's important that we become better. But yet, we can't be better if people just want to ignore the facts. And that is, we do live in a country that engineered the current predicament that we now face, particularly when we talk about the median wealth gap and that of white families having nearly 10 times that of Black families. Yeah, folks, that's problematic. You know, beyond housing, Rothstein explores our government actions that, perpetrated segregation. Local zoning laws were often used to confine Black residents to specific areas by designating those areas for industrial use. Or multi-family housing, while reserving suburban neighborhoods for single-family homes. One of the challenges that we continue to see here in the 21st century is that even in white liberal or white progressive communities, they reject the idea of affordable housing. They reject the idea of affordable housing, much like for the longest time they rejected Walmart. Right? Walmart, would bring around kind of folks who only can afford to shop in Walmart versus the community Target that may be there. I'm not sure if you knew that or not. Hopefully you did. I feel like it's common knowledge, but I feel like I have an obligation to share that tad bit of information with you. Those things are there. If you create zoning laws that says we only can have single family homes, and yet the processes have excluded Black people for the longest period of time for owning single housing or single unit family homes. Oftentimes they have to congregate in what we call multi-family housing. Here in the Northeast, that's become quite popular. Even going beyond the color line, though the color line is vastly important, a lot of folks can't afford a home. In the state of Massachusetts, the average home, I don't know, it's around $650,000. $650,000. Who can afford that kind of stuff? I sit there and I think about it. Public housing policies, initially segregated Black and white tenants, right? We created Section 8 housing, excuse me. And we created Section 8 housing because this is a way where we didn't even want, or I shouldn't say we, the industry, the government, those practicing systemic racism, did not want even lower class, working class, poor Black and white folks living in the same family units. We wanted the poor folks to be segregated. And that allows us, right, politically, to vote against our common interests because we've elevated the notion of race and this myth of community that centers around race above our commonality of class struggle. And class struggle is a reality, but yet race will always usurp class, particularly the way these systems are put in place, in the ways, of course, that people can't build these communities that are there. I want to give you an example of something. I highly recommend you going out and you purchasing this work. And in it, I thought this was just a telling thing I noted. In chapter 11, one of the things it says here, of course, is that from 1957 to 1968, right? That is in the heart of the civil rights period, right? We have Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. We have with all deliberate speed by the Supreme Court, 1955. We know, of course, in 1957 with the Little Rock Nine, and by 68, that's the year we're going to lose not only Bobby Kennedy, but we're going to lose brother Martin Luther King. And all that work in progress by King and others, we start to question, well, what does that mean? So it mentions here from 1957 to 1968, Congress adopted civil rights laws prohibiting second-class citizenship for African Americans in public accommodations and transportation, voting, and employment. Although not without challenges, all right, without challenges, if you come from my hometown in Montgomery, Alabama, one of the things that happened there is when we started to desegregate schools, a lot of folks went to churches and created Christian schools. That way the churches couldn't touch them. And thus we have this notion of segregated schools that were in place. Although not without challenges, these laws were effective, ending segregation in housing. However, is much more complicated. Prohibiting discrimination in voting and restaurants mostly requires modifying future behavior. But ending de jure segregation of housing requires undoing past actions that may seem irreversible. President Kennedy, 1962 executive order attempted to end the financing of residential segregation by federal agencies. In 1966, President Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ, pushed to have a housing discrimination bill passed. But in a rare legislative defeat, the Senate killed his proposal. 2 years later, civil rights advocates tried again. This time, the Senate eked out by the narrowest of margins a Fair Housing Act. And this Fair Housing Act prohibited private discrimination in housing sales and rentals. Shortly after, pressured by national emotion following the assassination of Brother King, the House of Representatives enacted a law for the first time since 1883, when the Supreme Court rejected the Civil Rights Act ban on housing. Government endorsed the rights of African Americans to reside where they chose and could afford. Here's the kicker as I wrap this up. This law is now a half century old. You might think that 50 years would be long enough to erase the effects of government promotion of and support for segregation, but the public policies of yesterday still shape the racial landscape of today. And that is the wonderful stuff that Richard Rothstein really delves into in this piece. He really affords us an opportunity to think about the ways in which these policies not only kind of shape the physical layout of our cities and our communities, but it shaped attitudes and perceptions that people have. See, when we segregate folks, they go to this school and they live in this house and they go to this church. They don't really come in contact with other folks. Certain private industries and the government have done their job by keeping folks from different races from connecting and building a bridge of connectivity that's there. You know, the government fostered stereotypes and reinforced racial prejudice about people of color and how they carried on in our communities. You know, the segregation of schools, which is, as I mentioned, really connected to residential segregation further entrench these disparities in educational opportunities and outcomes, really holding a generation of Black folks back because they had to endure a inferior education for a period of time. I think these are the things that we have to think about, not the glory, this glory aspect that we live into about this harmonious idea of living within a racially colorblind society. It doesn't exist. And those structures in place. And if folks don't understand their history about these things, because you didn't learn it in school. And I assure you, there are lawyers, and I know a few of them who are friends of mine who went to law school, and they don't know anything. They may have heard of redlining and a couple of buzzwords that's out there, but really the deptitude by which the United States government engaged in an act of de jure segregation is problematic. So I mention these things, and you say, okay, Eddie, you pointed it out. Yeah, we understand. We live in a system and in a society that practice systemic racism. Racism is real. It exists. We've heard that from you before. We get that all too well. You know, I'll go out and I'll buy this book because you said I should. And yes, you should. But then the question is, so what can we learn from this discussion? What can we learn from this book, The Color of Law? First, I mean, I think we must recognize that racial segregation is not an unfortunate relic of the past, but it is a living legacy, a continuity that affects millions and millions of Americans today across all races. We're all impacted. Racism hurts. Racism hurts the economy. It promotes violence. It promotes a sense of disdain. It does racism is not helpful. And the sooner we figure this out, the quicker we will work to address these things. We need to think about the disparities in wealth. There are people of color who have not, do not, never will own a home. And that's not their fault. It is not their fault. So while folks have two, three, four, five homes, hey, good for you. There are folks who don't enjoy such luxury because the system was tied in. These disparities in wealth, education, healthcare, even this criminal justice system we have, these are not coincidence, right? These things were established. They just didn't happen to grow out of the ground like some miracle plant. They were engineered, as I mentioned earlier. And they are the result of deliberate choices made by those in power. Not a conspiracy. The politics and reality of this work is it's just fantastic. I think the second thing, acknowledging a history, it obligates us to take action, right? To engage. Rothstein emphasizes that if segregation was created by public policy, it can be dismantled by public policy. But we have to vote. We have to engage in our civic opportunities and duties to really change these elements. They're just not, all of a sudden going to vanish or disappear. You got to do something, folks. If you live in Newburyport, and I'm talking to you. If you live in Newburyport, you need to look around the community of Newburyport. I've engaged in community work there for a period of time. I know a number of folks who are doing community work there now. And one of the questions we continue to ask is, why aren't there any people of color living in Newburyport? What is the challenge of the affordability? The big response I get, and particularly from white folks, is, well, white folks, we can't afford to live there. But you do live there. You do. And that is a reality. Public pressure brings about public change. Public change leads to good public policy. That is what needs to happen. That is what needs to happen in Newburyport. That is what needs to happen in Boston. That needs to happen in my hometown of Montgomery and a lot of communities around. That is the reality. While the task may seem daunting, overwhelming, folks, it's not impossible. I mean, let's just take ourselves back to the 1960s, the late 50s, and the realities that folks across the color line were facing and trying to bring shifts to a apartheid system here in the United States. And Jim Crow did not just live in Montgomery, Alabama. It lived in Sacramento, California, Los Angeles, California. It lived in, that's right, Boston, Massachusetts, as this wonderful book points out, right? Policymakers, advocates, and communities, we got to work and organize to address these structural inequalities that continue to persist, that are problematic. So I have a list of a couple things I noted here in ways in which I think we can really bring about these challenges that are there. You know, let's talk about housing reform policies. I think is the key. Right? How do we prioritize affordable housing and create incentive for integration? Every time and I even see this in communities of color, particularly in Lawrence, Massachusetts, that is a overwhelmingly predominant community of color where outside people have come in and they've built luxury houses or luxury apartments. And they've built this mainly because there's a train station right there so you can get your hipsters, right? Who can hop on a train, head down to Boston, go to work all day, hang out with their friends, have a little happy hour afterwards, right? In their gentrified neighborhoods down there. Hop on a train and buzz back to Lawrence, Massachusetts. And the folks who are moving into these luxury housing units, and they call it this luxury apartments, are not people of color. I think the next thing we can do is we could really lean on let's address the racial wealth gap, right? Let's focus on policies such as down payment assistance for Black home buyers and first time Black home buyers and representative measures, those that have harmed people of color, such as redlining. And let's address these inequities and the things that have caused decades of discriminatory practices, right? Let's focus on those things. Another thing you can do, and I think this would be super beneficial, is let's think about education and let's think about what the racial demographics look like in terms of the students who are sitting in the classrooms and those who are in front of the classrooms. Let's start thinking about, what can we do to make sure that all folks have a high quality education, regardless of their zip code, right? Let's start thinking critically about breaking the cycle of poverty and segregation. Folks, this is organizing. This is intentionality. You have to want to do this. Newburyport folks, you have to want to do this. Let's talk about zoning laws and the ways in which zoning laws continue to create restrictive ordinances that really drive segregation and prevent the construction of affordable housing. When you drive through certain neighborhoods, and I'm just going to call one out, and I don't mean to call you out, I'm just going to name it. Recently I was traveling through Ipswich, and Ipswich, I think, is fairly progressive, liberal. That's what I hear, but you never know anymore. And one of the things that I see pop up all the time is vote against this or vote against that. And I start looking up what do these things mean? And these are just access to affordable housing. And what folks tend to do is they say, well, it's going to cause congestion or cause environmental degradation. And there's always an excuse why communities cannot build affordable housing. One of the wonderful things that this book does is it rejects the notion of color blindness. When it comes to addressing racial inequity, we've got to move away from that. We have to stop pretending that we operate within a colorblind society. Race is real. Racism is very much real. We live in a country where our government, the United States government, created structures in which the ripple effects are still in place today. That 8%, I'm sorry, not that 8%, that $8, right? The total wealth of Black folks in the greater Boston area is $8. That is a product of a system that was engineered. I think that will really drive some of the things that need to happen. And folks, I hope you'll take this episode as a lesson on how do we think about these things. I hope I'm not talking to myself. I hope I'm not the only one who wants to think and engage, because I know I'm not talking to myself. And I know there are plenty of you who are listening. What that means is you're going to have to get up and you're going to have to do something. Feel free to reach out to me and invite me in. I rarely say no to anything, especially if it means engaging in the work of the good for the public humane of society that is necessary. And as always, if you have questions for Brother Eddie Carson here at Race Matters, Chopper Radio, then I will be more than happy to join. Folks, thanks for chiming in on this episode. Thanks for listening to me. Thanks for us thinking about the patterns that are there. And more than anything, don't pretend and don't be this good, passive, liberal, progressive person or someone who is just not willing to acknowledge nor willing to talk about the challenges that exist. I challenge you to do something. I assure you I am on my end, and I'm happy to show up and help you. Folks, thank you so much. This is Race Matters. I appreciate you chiming in. Be well.